Is the Hebrew Bible the history of Israel or of Judaism? At least that's the question, or a question like Julius Wellhausen asked in his book Prolegomena to the History of Ancient Israel. He wrote this first in 1878 and then did a second edition in 1883, which I gave it the current title. And I think his goal is essentially to be able to construct an ancient history of Israel. Yet in his historical studies that he was participating with other scholars, he encountered this problem based upon what he felt was biblical evidence, namely that parts of the Bible seem to come much later than the history itself. So he reasoned if the Bible, or the Hebrew Bible, in particular the Law of Moses, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, if these books were, say, written or edited or redacted in the 500s and 600s BC, then they're not really aiming to be an accurate representation of Israel's history, but rather a reconstruction in order to solidify what Judaism was at that time during the Assyrian and Babylonian periods. Well, that's an interesting question that has, I would say, controlled the history of biblical studies for a couple hundred years, roughly. Maybe 150 is more accurate. And there's something to the question. For example, sometimes I'll be reading the book of Genesis, and there'll be a statement like in Genesis 12:6. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. And then there's this little comment that says, at that time, the Canaanites were in the land. You think, at that time, the Canaanites were in the land. So who's ever reading Genesis might be thinking the Canaanites were not in the land, but this comment helps them to see that they were. So there is a bit of a disconnect. At the same time, if Abraham lived, let's say at 1800 or 1900 BC, the 19th century BC, well, then anyone reading Genesis, even if Moses wrote it and gave it to the Israelites, would maybe need to have these historical pieces of information. Other pieces like Genesis 13:7, we find, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Again, why do we need to know that they were dwelling in the land? Well, even if Moses wrote it, I would suggest that whoever the audience would be still be hundreds of years later, and maybe this would be historical information that would be valuable for them to understand it. The one piece of the puzzle that I think makes the question a little bit more complicated is a passage like Deuteronomy 34:10, which says, "And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." Well, if Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, it's weird to have a statement in Deuteronomy 34 that says, "And there has not risen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." So, I mean, there might be some biblical evidence that there is work being done in these documents to help the original readers and later readers, presumably, understand what's going on, because there's a disconnect between the history described and the readers. For me, for the most part, I mean, Genesis makes sense if, let's say, Moses wrote it, which is the position that I am comfortable with. How did he write? Well, he's going to be writing to an audience that is separated from many, many years from the time of Abram and the patriarchs. So there's going to be these comments that are needed. I'll get to the Deuteronomy bit here in a second. But going back to Wellhausen, so he sees things like this. Many people do. I think Baruch Spinoza was one who saw this and really try to push the dial on the historical study of the Bible, and probably in order to push back against traditional views of inspiration and authority, namely that the Bible came from God and was inspired from God. Now, someone like Wellhausen, actually I don't know how he would articulate that, but my guess is that he is more of a historian and is not thinking in those categories in his historical study. But he goes further and he begins to see giant, he's not alone in this, of course, he's just one of them, strands of tradition in the Hebrew Bible. So he identifies three primary sources, at least for the law. He thinks there's a priestly source, and he sees this in material that is very, very interested in judicial or tabernacle-like organization. And story kind of gets, or narrative gets pushed to the side. I mean, it's maybe there, but in order to just justify many, many chapters, say, on the construction of the Pentateuch. And one way he thinks that you can discern this is through the divine name Elohim being used. Okay. Then he says there's another source, this Yahwistic source, that prefers the divine name Yahweh over Elohim for God. And you see this source primarily telling simple stories like Abraham and Isaac and so on. And then a third source would be the Deuteronomic source, which wrote the book of Deuteronomy because it seems to be a sort of independent construction that makes sense on its own. All right, well, this is a bit more of a complicated argument, one that I think goes beyond biblical citation and uses a sort of discerning eye, historical eye, to discern the possibility of various sources. Now, I already kind of tipped my hat that personally I'm very comfortable with Moses being the author. At the same time, I understand that these observations they don't come out of nowhere. There's an intelligent historical study of the Hebrew Bible, one that I think if you just ignore or just say, well, that's silly because it disagrees with me, you might miss maybe some insight that you could otherwise get. So is there maybe a strand of prior writings that you can find in the Torah? I think the answer is pretty clearly yes. I mean, if you read the book of Genesis, it seems to be organized around this phrase, the generations of. These are the generations of, these are the generations of. For example, Genesis 5:1 says, this is the book of the generations of Adam. This is literally the Toledot of Adam. This is the book of generations. What's going on there? Well, think about it this way. If Moses is putting together the book of Genesis, he lives, I don't know the exact dates, but let's just say he lives in 1400, and Abraham lives in 1850. That's over 400 years in difference. Where does Moses learn about the life of Adam? Sure, people told stories and communicated. I'm sure that happened. But could there not have been written sources? And could Toledot, the book of generations, simply be these written sources? We see this throughout Scripture. I mean, if you read the book of Kings, frequently you have, and if you want to learn more about these kings, look to the book of, etc., this history book or this history book. The Bible frequently is referring to other writings. It's pretty normal to do that. And it seems to me that if you're writing the book of Genesis, you're going to need to use sources in order to write it, because you live hundreds of years later. This seems to be a pretty common sense, normal thing. I mean, Moses wrote, I would say, the Pentateuch, and it stands to reason that when he's writing about things that are before his time, then he would need sources like any writer today. The Christians typically will say that the Bible is inspired of God, but written by human authors, and that means you're going to use sources. This is why, for example, Luke in his gospel book talks about interviewing witnesses to Jesus before he writes his gospel account. There's a regular way that these books are written, but because of a belief in providence, namely that all things have a sort of meaning and coherence and structure to them because of the divine mind, we can speak of inspiration, God also inspiring these books. So perhaps Wellhausen and others are observing things like this, and maybe you find in Genesis in certain places there's a name privilege like Yahweh. In other places there isn't, simply because of the genre and the writing, and because Moses is writing this kind of intellectual work, the Torah, the law, but he's integrating prior sources, his own way of putting things. If I'm writing a paper, or a book, I'm frequently doing this. I'm interacting with earlier authors, and I'm quoting them, and I'm using maybe their language, my language, but it's still my writing. This seems to be a pretty straightforward way of doing that. Now, Deuteronomy 34:10 is a bit of a trickier one. There has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. I think the answer to this is pretty straightforward, unless you're highly suspicious. The answer is basically, yeah. So Moses creates this writing. He creates what you might say is the book of Deuteronomy. It's an organization of his speeches, of a bit of a narrative structure. He puts it all together, and then he dies. And someone after his life, like a Joshua or someone else, says, "Great, let's get this book copied and ready for everyone else." And he adds, let's say, this final verse or line as a sort of capstone to the work of Moses. A sort of, sometimes in books today you have a preface that's written by another author for the book, or you have a sort of epilogue or something that could be as well. Not usually, though. I mean, this seems to be incredibly normal. I published a book, I think, late last year. I can't remember the date offhand. I wrote all the words. I gave it to a publisher. They edited it. They might have put like some final formatting pieces on it, published it. But everyone knows it's my book. I don't really see why it has to be any different here. Moses wrote and said all the things in it. It's Mosaic. He wrote it. Pretty simple. There might have been a sort of organization at the end, how to fit it into a scroll, how to maybe order some of the structures on that. There might be a couple sentences added at the end as a sort of editorial comment. I mean, to me, it just seems like a very straightforward thing. And if you're a Christian, I don't think this has any issue at all to do with inspiration or providence. It's just how God wrote the book through people. Pretty straightforward, pretty normal. I know that it is. Some people see this and simply say, well, Moses could have wrote this prophetically. If you want to go that way, great. More power to you. I have no problem with that. I think at the end of the day, if you're from a Christian point of view, you're simply going to say, because in God's providence, the book's inspired through human writers. So there's divine inspiration through human writers. That's pretty standard. However, I want to return to the question that I asked. That was a little bit of a apologia, because I know if you're a religious person, you might see this video and say, well, what's the point of the question? Well, I gave a little bit of that, but really what I'm driving at is this. I think, Wellhausen's actually pretty careful. He's saying the law is either it's a starting point for a history of either Israel or Judaism, depending on where you put the timeline. He used the word starting point, and for I think a very insightful reason. And the answer is, if you read the Torah, the law, or if you read the whole Old Testament history, you begin to realize that it can't really be a history book. If you have, let's say, a history of the patriarchs till the Babylonian captivity, it's about 1,500 years of time. And the Bible itself, the Old Testament, is like this big. It's hyper selective. There's huge gaps of time. If you read the book of Kings, you see this all the time. Even in a book like the Pentateuch, you have this. Just read Exodus. You have that. There's a whole focus on the Exodus, but roughly from Exodus, let's say 20-ish, 19-ish, through the end of Leviticus, almost nothing happens narratively. It's all at one point. The whole instruction of the Pentateuch. I know there's a golden calf event, but there's the Pentateuch instructions, and then the book of Leviticus opens, Leviticus 1:1, after the tabernacle is constructed, and the whole book is a speech from in front of that tent. Like, no, it's all at one piece of time. It's very limited. Different things do happen in Numbers. Than Deuteronomy is essentially a recollection of what happened in a number of speeches by Moses. Even in the Torah, of course Genesis is different, but it's a very compressed, limited, selected history. Even the book of Genesis that tells you so much about Adam, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and a few other characters. Those are the main ones highlighted. It's hugely selective. Like, we don't have full histories of the brothers of Joseph, full histories of everything that Jacob did, everything that Isaac did, everything that Cain and Abel did. It's these little tiny little pieces. Like, you could write whole books on each year of their life. And it brings us to the conclusion that the Bible was never intended to be a history book. It may exist in real history and record real history. That's, of course, true. But it was always intended to be a selection of history in order to communicate an argument. And Wellhausen will say things like, in the later time of Judaism, the history is put together in order to sort of justify the temple cult and Jewish worship and so on. Okay, maybe, but what I think is a more sturdy or simple answer, which people have recognized throughout all time, whether or not they have articulated it clearly or not, is that the Bible is a theological work. It is concerned with who and what God is and what he has done for his people in redemption, salvation, and judgment. And so at the end of the day, I think, yes, Wellhausen is a good historical reader in the sense of he knows that the law is not a history book, but maybe a starting point to do history. I think he goes, much further than I'd be comfortable with discerning strands of tradition and history that I think is, you would have to be it doesn't seem obvious to readers. And there are other explanations for that diversity, like that Toledot thing I talked about, or perhaps sort of intentional writing style that is just different than how we think of history today. And ultimately, I think because the genre is not history, although it exists in history and sometimes records history as we understand it, but the genre is theological writing through different things like poetry and wisdom literature, etc. But it is meant to tell us something about God and the things that he has created. And therefore, the selectivity of the historical figures is selected in order to teach us theological truths and to show us who God is. Because the writers of the book worship the God of Israel who created heaven and earth. So, if you look at the question of this video, is the Hebrew Bible the history of Israel or of Judaism? It's kind of a false dilemma. It's neither. The Hebrew Bible is a testimony to the God who created the world. It's a witness to him and his works in the created, his works in his creation. It is a theological work that is selective in order to teach us what we must know about God and his people. That is the way that I would answer that question. Yes, I would have pretty significant disagreements with Wellhausen, and part of it has to do with my view of providence. I think he would look at the historical documents and find lots of material there that would generate this idea of historical strands and all that. But because I believe in an order beyond space and time, I think I am much more comfortable with the mystery or ignorance of how things happened precisely historically, and have confidence in a God who brings order to the seeming chaos of history, and through human authors has inspired what we call the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, or the Torah, whatever you want to call it, the Old Testament in Christian idiom, whatever it is that document is. And while this probably will seem hopelessly traditional, I have very little problem, in fact no problem, with affirming Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch.